poor girl spent her last coins to pay the bus fare for a millionaire. What happened next left everyone speechless. Jason Stone maneuvered his luxury car through the winding city streets, his mind preoccupied with the weight of the responsibilities awaiting him the next day. His schedule was packed with high-stakes meetings, financial decisions, and obligations that most people could only imagine. But in a moment of distraction, he made a wrong turn, finding himself on an unfamiliar, dimly lit road. The eerie silence of the street should have been a warning. Before he could react, shadows emerged from the alleyways, figures moving with calculated precision. A gang of robbers swiftly surrounded his vehicle, leaving him no choice but to comply. He stepped out, his hands raised, the chill of the night pressing against his skin. Minutes later, Jason stood on the sidewalk, stripped of everything: his car, his wallet, his phone. The reality of his situation settled in like a cold wave. For the first time in his life, he had nothing. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he started walking, his polished shoes scuffing against the rough pavement. The main avenue wasn't far, but when he reached it, he realized another problem. There were no taxis in sight, and without a phone, calling for his private driver was impossible. His only option? Public transportation. A few blocks away, Jessica sat at a bus stop, exhausted. It had been an especially grueling day at the diner where she worked. The shift had been relentless. Tables full, customers impatient, and her tips barely enough to cover her next meal. All she wanted was to get home, kick off her worn-out sneakers, and escape into sleep. When the bus finally pulled up, she sighed in relief. She stepped inside, counting the last of her coins before dropping them into the fare box. Then, making her way to the back, she slid into a seat by the window, resting her head against the cool glass. But just as she closed her eyes, a sharp voice cut through the air. "I already told you, sir, no money, no ride." Jessica blinked, turning her attention to the front of the bus. A tense exchange was unfolding between the driver and a man standing at the entrance. His clothes, though expensive, were crumpled, and there was a lost, almost desperate look in his eyes. "I was robbed," he explained, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "They took everything, my car, my wallet, my phone. I just need to get home." The driver, unimpressed, crossed his arms. Every day someone tries to pull that excuse. No money, no ride. Jason exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Never in his life had he felt this powerless. He was a man used to control, to solutions at the press of a button. Now, for the first time, he was at the mercy of circumstances he couldn't buy his way out of. Then, from the back of the bus, a voice spoke up. Jessica stood. "I'll pay for his fare." The bus fell silent. Jessica looked up, startled. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, especially not a stranger. His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment he searched for hesitation, for expectation, for any sign that she wanted something in return. But there was nothing. Just quiet sincerity. She had made her decision without a second thought. "You don't have to do that," he murmured, shifting uncomfortably. The idea of accepting help from a stranger, especially when he was usually the one offering it, felt foreign. "I already did," she replied, her voice steady. "You better get on before he changes his mind." Without waiting for an argument, she handed the money to the driver. Jason hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. He wasn't used to being in situations where he had no choice. But tonight he had no wallet, no phone, only the kindness of this girl. With a nod of gratitude, he walked past her and took a seat a few rows ahead. As the bus rumbled forward, he glanced back discreetly. Who was she? In his world, favors always came with strings attached. Every gesture had an agenda. Yet this girl, someone who clearly had so little, had helped him without hesitation, without expectation. She had no idea who he was, and still, she had stepped in when no one else would. And no matter how hard he tried, Jason couldn't stop thinking about it minutes past. The city lights flickered against the bus windows, their glow washing over Jessica's tired face. When the bus finally reached her stop, she stood up, moving toward the exit with quiet ease. Jason felt a sudden, unshakable urge to thank her properly. "Hey." She turned, looking at him with mild curiosity. There was no anticipation, no assumption, just an openness that made Jason hesitate for the briefest moment before he found his words. "Thank you. You have no..." He stopped, exhaling. You have no idea how much you helped me today." Jessica's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. And with that, before he could say anything else, she stepped off the bus and disappeared into the night. Jason sat still, watching as the doors slid shut behind her. He didn't even know her name, yet he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't forget her anytime soon. The bus continued its route, weaving through the city's bright streets, but Jason barely noticed. His fingers tapped absently against his knee, his mind replaying the events of the night. It was surreal. He, one of the wealthiest men in the city, had just been helped by a girl who, judging by her simple uniform and exhausted demeanor, likely had far less than he did. The realization unsettled him, pride prickled at his ego. He had spent his life building an empire, making sure he never had to rely on anyone. Yet tonight, stripped of everything, he had been forced to accept a stranger's kindness. And it changed something in him. Jessica, on the other hand, had already moved on. To her, the gesture was nothing extraordinary, just a simple act of kindness. She had faced enough hardships in her life to understand that sometimes, even the smallest gesture could mean everything to someone in need. As the bus approached her stop, she reached up and pulled the signal cord, then rose from her seat with quiet ease. Stepping toward the exit, she remained unaware of the pair of eyes still following her every move. Jason, despite himself, was still watching. The moment she disappeared into the night, he forced himself to look away, unsettled by how deeply that brief encounter had affected him. "Next stop, downtown," the driver called out, his voice breaking Jason's thoughts. He let out a long sigh. As the bus pulled up to the stop, he stepped off and found himself walking through the familiar streets of the city's elite district. The towering buildings, the polished sidewalks, the soft hum of luxury cars gliding past. It was a world he had always known. But tonight, it all felt different. His building loomed ahead, a sleek glass monument to success. Normally, he would have pulled up in his car, stepping out with purpose, his phone in hand, ready to address whatever business awaited him. But tonight he approached on foot. No car, no phone, no wallet. Just him? As he neared the entrance, the doorman's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Mr. Stone, is everything all right?" Jason forced a small smile, running a hand through his hair. "Just a bad day, James. Can you let me in?" The older man hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course, sir." Stepping inside the opulent lobby, Jason barely acknowledged the familiar surroundings. The marble floors, the marble art, the soft scent of expensive cologne lingering in. He took the elevator up in silence, and when he finally entered his penthouse, he let out a slow breath and sank onto the couch. For the first time in a long time, his world felt distant. His daily routine, his endless meetings, the carefully constructed life he had built. It was all still there, waiting for him. Yet something was different. What unsettled him most, though, was the fact that he couldn't stop thinking about that girl. The next morning, Jessica stepped out of the small house she shared with her mother, ready to face another long day of work. Their home was modest but filled with warmth, nestled in a quiet neighborhood where life moved at a steady, unhurried pace. Since her father's passing, she had taken on every responsibility she could, juggling school and her job at the diner to help make ends meet. The early morning air was crisp as she walked through the familiar streets, the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixing with the distant hum of the city awakening. She made her way to the bus stop, the rhythm of her daily routine unchanged. Leaning against the post, she allowed herself a few moments of stillness before the rush of the day took over. Meanwhile, across the city, Jason Stone awoke with a single thought. He had to find her. It was an impulsive idea, irrational even, but something inside him refused to let it go. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just let the encounter from last night fade into memory. As he passed through the sleek, glass-walled lobby of his building, he spotted James, the doorman who had let him in the night before. "James," Jason called, his tone carrying a quiet urgency. The older man turned, still somewhat puzzled by Jason's unusual circumstances the previous night. "Yes, sir? I need you to find something for me." Jason hesitated for only a brief second before continuing. "I need to know where—" "There's a diner near the bus line that runs through downtown." James blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a request. "Any particular one, sir?" Jason exhaled, recalling the image that had been etched in his mind since the moment he saw her. Her worn but clean uniform, the shade of blue distinct against the dim lighting of the bus. "It has to be one where the employees wear blue uniforms," he said firmly. James nodded, his curiosity evident but his professionalism intact. "I'll look into it and get back to you as soon as possible." Jason muttered his thanks before stepping outside, the weight of his own decisions settling over him. This wasn't logical, it wasn't necessary, and yet, he couldn't ignore it. A few hours later, the soft chime of the diner's doorbell rang as Jason stepped inside. The place was unassuming yet inviting, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm, buttery pastries. A few patrons sat at the tables, engaged in quiet conversations, while the staff moved briskly, balancing trays and refilling cups. The gentle hum of daily life filled the space, simple, steady, real. Jason made his way to the counter, his gaze sweeping the room as he searched for the person who had unknowingly taken root in his mind. And then he saw her. Jessica stood behind the counter, carefully arranging a tray of coffee cups. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and her expression held quiet concentration as she worked, moving with the effortless grace of someone used to the rhythm of long shifts and demanding customers. Without realizing it, Jason smiled. He stepped closer, waiting for the moment she would notice him. But Jessica was lost in her task, her focus unwavering until, finally, she glanced up. Her hands stilled, her eyes widened slightly. "You," she murmured, more surprised than anything else. Jason tilted his head, amusement flickering in his expression. "Me?" Jessica blinked, as if trying to decide whether she was actually seeing him or if exhaustion was playing tricks on her. "What are you doing here?" "I came to settle my debt." Her brows knitted in confusion. "What debt?" Jason leaned casually against the counter. "You paid for my bus fare yesterday. I think it's only fair to return the favor." Jessica let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "It was nothing. You don't have to do that." He raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Then at least let me buy you a coffee." She hesitated, studying him as if trying to figure out why a man like him, polished, clearly from a different world, had come all this way for something so small. But eventually she shrugged. "If that's how you want to settle your debt, all right." Turning, she grabbed a clean cup, filled it with steaming coffee, and placed it in front of him. Jason wrapped his fingers around the handle, his gaze steady on her as he took the first sip. "Have you been working here long?" he asked. 2 years. "And besides work, what do you do?" Jessica narrowed her eyes slightly, suspicious. "Why do you want to know?" Jason chuckled. "Because I'm curious?" She considered his response for a moment before deciding there was no harm in answering. "I study business administration at night. I want to open my own bakery someday." Jason's eyebrows lifted slightly, impressed. "That's amazing." She shrugged, as if brushing off the weight of her own dream. "It's just an idea for now, but I'm going to make it happen." He smiled, his admiration genuine. "I believe in you." Jessica chuckled softly, shaking her head. "How can you believe that? You just met me yesterday." Jason took another slow sip before replying, his voice thoughtful. "Some people, you just recognize right away." Jessica frowned slightly, not entirely sure how to respond to that. There was something about the way he said it, like he saw something in her that even she hadn't fully grasped yet. Before she could say anything, a coworker called her name, pulling her back into the flow of work. Jason remained at the counter, watching as she moved effortlessly between customers. He didn't quite understand it himself, but something about being here, in this tiny diner, talking to this girl, it felt different. It felt real. And for the first time in a long while, Jason realized that was exactly what he'd been missing. The doorbell chimed again as Jason stepped into the diner for the second time that week. The familiar scents of freshly brewed coffee and warm, oven-baked bread filled the air, blending seamlessly with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clatter of plates. The scene was almost identical to his last visit, ordinary, predictable. Yet, to him, something felt different this time. It was Jessica, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Jason watched her move behind it, effortlessly balancing trays, pouring coffee, and exchanging small smiles with customers. Unlike before, she seemed to register his presence immediately. "You came back to pay off another debt?" she asked, her tone light as she poured him a cup of coffee, before he even had to ask. Jason smiled, wrapping his fingers around the warm ceramic. "Maybe, but this time I'll pay for it myself." Jessica arched an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Oh, that's good. I was starting to worry I'd have to bail you out again." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't doubt it, but just so you know, today I came prepared." She gave a small smirk before turning away to tend to another order, leaving Jason to watch her from a quiet distance. The diner was busier than the last time, filled with a steady stream of customers coming and going. But despite the rush, Jessica moved through it all with an effortless rhythm, focused, efficient, yet never too hurried to offer a warm nod or a polite word to those she served. There was something about the way she carried herself, something unspoken yet undeniably captivating. And as Jason sat there sipping his coffee, he realized he wasn't just here to pay off a debt. He was here because, for the first time in a long while, he wanted to be. As the rush finally died down and the diner settled into a quieter rhythm, Jessica leaned against the counter, studying him with mild curiosity. "So, what do you do for a living?" Jason hesitated. He knew the truth had the power to shift everything, to place an invisible barrier between them. But instead of fabricating a different life, he offered the simplest version of reality. "I work in the hotel business." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "That explains why you were so observant about the coffee last time." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Maybe." She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "And why that field?" Jason exhaled, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with his fingertip. "Because it was the easiest path." Jessica frowned. "Easy? Running hotels doesn't sound simple." "Don't get me wrong," he said with a quiet chuckle. "But when you're born into a family that already owns an empire, some decisions are made for you before you ever get the chance to choose." She watched him carefully, sensing there was more beneath the surface than he was letting on, but instead of pressing, she simply nodded. "And you?" Jason asked, smoothly shifting the conversation. "Still dreaming about that bakery?" The change in her expression was immediate. Her eyes brightened, and a soft spark of excitement flickered across her face. "Always," she said. "It's my biggest dream." "And what's stopping you?" Jessica let out a short laugh. "Money, time, circumstances, take your pick." Jason studied her for a moment. "You don't seem like someone who gives up easily." She smiled, but there was a quiet realism in her expression. "I'm not. But sometimes the road is longer than we'd like it to be." Jason nodded. He understood that feeling all too well. Before they could say more, one of Jessica's coworkers hurried over. "Jessica, can you grab the order at table 3? She gave a quick nod before stepping away, seamlessly returning to work. Jason sat back, watching her move through the space, greeting customers, chatting with her coworkers, handling every task with effortless ease. There was a natural rhythm to the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that made everything she did seem purposeful. And for the first time in a long while, Jason felt at peace. No expectation, no business meetings, no calculated conversations. Just a simple moment in an ordinary diner, with a girl who made the world feel a little more real. When he finished his coffee, he signaled for a staff member to settle the bill, leaving behind a generous tip. Before stepping out, he glanced toward Jessica one last time. She was still busy, but as he pushed open the door, he felt the weight of her gaze following him. He smiled to himself as he stepped outside. He would definitely be back. The following days fell into an easy rhythm. Every morning at the same time, Jason walked through the diner's door, always ordering coffee, always taking a seat at the counter. At first, Jessica pretended not to notice. But it didn't take long for her to realize his presence had quietly become part of her routine. He always struck up a conversation, and little by little, their exchanges grew more effortless. The guarded small talk gave way to something more natural, more familiar. And without meaning to, Jessica found herself looking forward to that moment each morning. The sound of the doorbell chiming, the brief pause before he made his way to the counter, the way he always greeted her with an easy smile. One day, as she set his coffee down in front of him, Jason leaned forward slightly. "Do you have a minute?" Jessica eyed him warily. "That depends." A smirk tugged at his lips. "I want to show you something." She hesitated, but curiosity won out. Okay. Jason pulled out his phone, swiped through his gallery, then turned the screen toward her. The image displayed an elegant beachfront hotel, its grand facade gleaming under a golden sunset, the waves rolling gently in the distance. Jessica blinked. You own that? Technically, I'm the heir to it, he said with a slight shrug. But yeah, I help run it. She studied the photo for a moment before handing the phone back. Sounds incredible. His smile widened. And it has a cafe inside. That caught her attention. Her expression shifted, interest sparking in her eyes. Now that makes it even more interesting. Jason laughed, as if he had been waiting for exactly that reaction. I knew you'd say that. Jessica crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. You must be used to places like that, right? Luxury hotels, fine dining, expensive everything? He leaned back, thoughtful. I grew up surrounded by that world, but lately, I've realized something. She raised an eyebrow. And what's that? His gaze flickered to the coffee cup in front of him, then back to her. Sometimes, the most valuable things are found in the simplest places. Jessica held his gaze for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with a small smile, she turned back to work, leaving Jason to sit there, wondering just how much truth had slipped into his own words. Jessica didn't know how to respond. There was something about the way he said it, something unspoken, deeper than just words. Before she could figure out what to say, the diner picked up again, forcing her back into the rhythm of work. But that morning, for the first time, she found herself wondering, who was Jason really? And why did she suddenly want to find out? Hours later, as the diner's neon sign flickered off for the night, Jessica stepped outside, stretching her tired limbs before making her way toward the bus stop. It had been a long day, yet there was a lingering energy in her chest, something new, something unsettled. She wasn't sure what it was. Reaching the stop, she leaned against the post and closed her eyes for a brief moment. Is it already closed? Her eyes snapped open at the familiar voice. She turned, startled, to find Jason leaning casually against a sleek car, definitely not the same one from the other night. What are you doing here? She asked, narrowing her eyes. He smiled, unfazed. Thought I'd give you a ride home. Jessica crossed her arms, skeptical. Trying to pay off another debt? Jason chuckled. Let's call it a courtesy. She bit her lip, studying him. Every logical part of her told her to refuse, but instead, she sighed and pulled the car door open. Jason's smile deepened as he slid into the driver's seat. The city lights blurred past the windows, casting fleeting reflections across the windshield. The ride was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. Instead, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. An intrigue neither of them acknowledged yet. Jessica turned to him, breaking the silence. Why do I feel like I should have said no to this? Jason smirked, eyes still on the road. Because I'm not a complete stranger? Exactly. She crossed her arms, pretending to be serious. You could be a maniac. He let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Well, if I were, don't you think I'd have revealed my evil intentions by now? Jessica exhaled through her nose, biting back a smile. That's exactly what a maniac would say. Jason glanced at her, amusement flickering in his gaze, and for the first time, Jessica realized she wasn't just intrigued by him, she was starting to enjoy this. True? Jessica let out a small chuckle. But, I still haven't decided if I trust you, Jason smirked. And how do you plan to figure that out? She tapped a thoughtful finger against her chin. I guess I'll need a few weeks of observation. Weeks? He raised an eyebrow. That seems like a long time. Trusting someone isn't something that happens overnight. Jason nodded slightly, as if considering her words. Fair enough. As the car turned onto a quieter street, Jessica realized they were nearing her house. The thought made her pause. She knew so little about Jason, despite their conversations. He carried himself with an easy confidence, yet he never really revealed much. And you? She asked, glancing at him. Where do you live? Jason hesitated for the briefest moment before keeping his usual half-smile. Downtown. Wow, she mused. So probably one of those fancy buildings I see when I take the bus? Maybe. Jessica narrowed her eyes playfully. You like giving vague answers, don't you? I just prefer keeping a little mystery. She let out a soft laugh. Well, I hope it's not a dark secret. Nothing dark, Jason assured, his tone light. Just a little boring, Jessica frowned. Why do you think that? He took a deep breath, his fingers flexing slightly on the steering wheel. I guess I spent too much time following a set script, doing what was expected of me. She wasn't entirely sure what he meant, but she could tell he wasn't just making small talk. Maybe it's time to change the script, she offered. Jason turned to her, the corner of his mouth lifting. Maybe. The car finally rolled to a stop in front of Jessica's modest home. She unfastened her seatbelt and turned to him. Thanks for the ride. Jason met her gaze. You're welcome. For a moment, neither of them moved. The night was still, the only sound the distant hum of the city. Then, with a small nod, Jessica opened the door and stepped out, feeling an odd sense of hesitation, like she wasn't quite ready for the moment to end. Jason watched as she walked up the small steps to her house, and just before she disappeared inside, she glanced back. He was still watching her, and for some reason, that made her smile. She opened the door but hesitated before stepping out. Will I see you tomorrow? Jason raised an eyebrow. At the diner? She smiled. Yes, see you tomorrow. Jessica nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind her. As she walked up the porch steps, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. The next morning, Jason showed up at the diner as usual. The doorbell chimed as he walked in, and Jessica glanced over her shoulder, already expecting him. You really are a man of your word. Always. He slid onto a counter stool. And today, I'm ready to try something different. She crossed her arms, amused. Venturing into the world of coffee choices? Yes. What do you recommend? Jessica tilted her head, studying him before grabbing a mug. You seem like someone who needs something strong, but not bitter. She smirked. Was that a compliment or an insult? Just an observation. Jessica set the cup in front of him. Try it. Jason took a sip, tasting the smooth yet bold flavor. Good, I know. She grinned, satisfied, and went back to work. Jason glanced around. He liked this place. The warmth, the routine, the way Jessica moved through it all so effortlessly. It was different from the structured, high-stakes world he was used to, a world he hadn't been completely honest about. As the days passed, Jessica began noticing small details that didn't quite add up. Jason never mentioned exactly where he worked. He was always vague about his responsibilities, his mannerisms, the way he held his cup, the way he talked about travel and fine dining spoke of refinement, not the kind learned, but the kind inherited. One afternoon, while wiping down the counter, she decided to ask, You never told me the name of your hotel. Jason held her gaze for a moment before answering. I don't think it matters. Oh, so it's a secret? He smirked. Maybe. Jessica crossed her arms. You really like keeping an air of mystery, huh? Let's just say I like avoiding certain judgment. Jason exhaled softly, rolling the handle of his coffee cup between his fingers. The kind that make people treat you differently once they know who you are. Jessica studied him. Something about his answer felt calculated, like he was choosing his words carefully. Before she could press further, the doorbell jingled, signaling another customer. Jason watched as she turned away, a faint tightness settling in his chest. He knew it was only a matter of time before Jessica found out the truth, and when that happened, everything between them might change. That evening, as Jessica walked home, something caught her attention. A sleek luxury car was parked on a side street, its polished exterior reflecting the glow of the streetlights. And stepping out of it, She stopped in her tracks. He didn't see her. He was engaged in conversation with a man in a tailored suit, his expression composed, his posture different, more assured, more like someone who belonged in that world. Jessica's stomach twisted. This wasn't the Jason who took the bus, who called his life boring, who kept his answers deliberately vague. This Jason was something else entirely. Had he been lying to her? A heavy feeling settled in her chest as she watched him, unseen. She had to find out the truth, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake in trusting him. Jessica tried to push aside the uneasiness that had settled in her chest ever since she'd seen Jason step out of that luxury car. No matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the image kept replaying in her mind. The Jason she had come to know, the one who sat at her counter every morning, who laughed easily and carried himself like just another guy, didn't seem to match the man she had glimpsed that night. There was something about him that didn't quite fit. He dressed simply, spoke casually, and acted like someone who lived an ordinary life. But the small details were starting to tell a different story. The way he carried himself, the way he never quite gave full answers, the way he always seemed effortlessly comfortable no matter where he was. It all hinted at something more, something he wasn't saying. For the next few days, Jessica tried to act normal, but the doubt never left her mind. Every time he walked through the door, every time he smiled at her, she found herself watching him more closely, looking for answers in the way he spoke, the way he moved. Who was Jason, really? That morning, just like always, the bell over the door jingled and Jason strolled in. He looked the same, casual jeans, a relaxed expression, that same easy confidence. But now, Jessica wasn't sure if she was looking at him the way she used to. "Good morning," he greeted, sliding onto his usual stool at the counter. Jessica returned the greeting, her voice carefully neutral. As she poured his coffee, Jason studied her. "You seem more serious today." She glanced up, just thinking about a few things. "Good things?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Haven't decided yet." Jason tilted his head slightly, watching her with quiet curiosity. "Can I help?" Jessica wrapped her fingers around the coffee pot, hesitating. Then she finally asked, "You told me you work in the hotel business, right?" Jason didn't blink. "That's right." "And what's the name of the hotel where you work?" His lips curled into a small smile, not his usual easy grin, but something different. It was as if he had been expecting this moment. "Why do you ask?" Jessica met his gaze evenly. Curiosity. Jason exhaled slowly, as if debating something, then set his cup down. "The Rockwell Hotels." Jessica froze. The name hit her like a sudden gust of wind. The Rockwell Hotels. She had heard of it, of course. Everyone had. It wasn't just a hotel, it was an empire, one of the biggest, most prestigious chains in the country. The kind of place where rooms cost more than what she made in a month. She stared at him, her mind working to piece it together. "You?" She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "You work for the Rockwell Hotels?" Jason nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes." Jessica let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "And what exactly do you do there?" He picked up his cup again, took a slow sip, then finally met her eyes. "I'm one of the owners." The silence between them stretched longer than Jessica would have liked. It was thick, unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Her stomach dropped as the realization fully sank in. Jason wasn't just an employee. He wasn't just another guy working behind the scenes. He was one of the owners. Jason Stone. The name carried weight, power, prestige. It explained everything. The quiet confidence in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself with effortless refinement, the luxury car she had spotted him stepping out of that night, all the little things she had noticed but never questioned too deeply. And most of all, the fact that he had never once mentioned his last name. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady the rush of thoughts in her mind. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Jason held her gaze, then let out a small sigh. "Because I wanted you to get to know me without my last name influencing anything." Jessica bit her lower lip, an odd sense of unease creeping into her chest. "That doesn't change who you are, Jason." He looked up at her then, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't change me, but for a lot of people it does." She folded her arms, the words pressing against her ribs. "So you think I would have treated you differently if I knew?" He gave a small shrug, but there was something vulnerable about the gesture. "I don't know, but I didn't want to take that risk." Jessica studied him, searching for any hint of hesitation, any sign that he wasn't being honest with her. But he was. That was the problem. The weight of it all settled over her. He had kept this from her, not to deceive her, but to hold on to something real. She took a slow breath. "You are right," she said finally, her voice softer now. "This does make me see you differently." Jason's expression shifted slightly, his eyes carefully searching hers. "What do you mean?" Jessica let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. "Now I understand why some things never made sense. You came here every day, like this was the only place in the city that served coffee, but someone like you, someone with your resources, could go to the best cafes in town." Jason's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "And who says this isn't one of the best?" She blinked, caught off guard by his answer. "You really like it here?" His gaze didn't waver. "I do." Jessica wasn't sure how to respond to that. For some reason, that answer unsettled her even more than his confession. Before she could say anything else, one of the diner's employees called her over to help with an order. She hesitated for half a second, then gave Jason one last glance before stepping away. But even as she took the order, moved between tables and forced herself to focus on work, her mind wasn't in the diner anymore. It was still at that counter, still replaying Jason's words over and over. Later that afternoon, when Jessica finally stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her skin, she found him waiting. Jason stood beside his car, casually leaning against the sleek frame, watching her as she approached. He didn't say anything. He just waited. And Jessica, for the first time since meeting him, wasn't sure if she wanted to keep walking or turn around and run. Jessica came to a stop, crossing her arms as she eyed him suspiciously. "Are you following me now?" Jason chuckled, the corner of his mouth lifting in amusement. "Let's just say I wanted to make sure you'd accept." "Another ride?" she finished for him, raising an eyebrow. He leaned casually against the car, hands in his pockets. "Something like that." Jessica pretended to consider it, tapping a finger against her chin. "That depends. Are you still going to keep hiding who you really are?" Jason's smile softened, more sincere this time. "I promise to be completely honest from now on." She studied him, searching for any hesitation. Trust wasn't something she gave easily, but after a few moments, she let out a small sigh and pulled the car door open, sliding inside. Jason followed, settling into the driver's seat. As they drove, he stole quick glances at her, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. "Are you mad at me?" he finally asked. Jessica let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to understand why someone like you wants to be treated like an ordinary guy." Jason exhaled, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Because sometimes being an ordinary guy feels more real." Jessica turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. For the first time, she realized that behind all that wealth and confidence, there was something else, something unsaid. She tilted her head slightly. "So what is it that you really want?" Jason hesitated. It was only a brief pause, but Jessica caught it. "I'm still trying to figure that out," he admitted, his voice quieter now. Jessica didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. Instead, she let the silence settle between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like the kind of silence that came with understanding, one that didn't need to be filled with words. When they finally pulled up in front of her house, Jessica hesitated, her hand resting on the door handle. "Thanks for the ride," she said, her voice softer than before. Jason gave her a small nod. "Any time." She stepped out, closing the door behind her, but something made her pause. Before heading inside, she turned back and saw him still sitting there, watching her. Not in a way that felt intrusive, but as if he was waiting for something. Jessica's chest tightened slightly, but she forced herself to look away and walk up the porch steps. That night, lying in bed, she stared up at the ceiling, unable to shake the strange feeling inside her. Something was changing, and somehow Jason was part of it. The next day, Jessica did her best to keep herself busy. Anything to keep Jason off her mind, but no matter how much she tried, he was there, lingering in the back of her thoughts. It wasn't just the fact that he was wealthy. It was the fact that he had hidden it from her for so long. That unsettled her more than anything else. By the time she got home that evening, she was still lost in thought, barely noticing the sound of her mother setting the table. Her mother glanced up, immediately catching on to her distraction. "You've been quiet today," she observed, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Something on your mind?" Jessica sighed, running a hand through her hair as she sat down. She didn't even know where to start. Finally, she exhaled. "I met someone." Her mother raised an eyebrow, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "And that's a bad thing?" Jessica let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "I don't know. He isn't exactly who I thought he was." Her mother's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Did he lie to you?" "Not exactly," Jessica admitted. "He just left out a few things." Her mother took a sip of tea, then placed the cup gently on the table. "And now, you don't know if you can trust him?" Jessica gave a small nod, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Her mother leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Sweetheart, sometimes people hide parts of themselves because they're afraid of being judged. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment to tell you." Jessica bit her lower lip, considering her words. Maybe. But even as she said it, a knot of uncertainty remained in her chest. The next morning, Jason arrived at the diner at his usual time. Jessica had been expecting him, but something about him seemed different today. His usual easy confidence was replaced with something else, something heavier. She poured his coffee and leaned against the counter, studying him. "Is everything okay?" Jason stirred his spoon in the cup absently before answering. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." Jessica tilted her head slightly. "About what?" He took a deep breath, as if choosing his words carefully. "About me hiding who I am." Jessica folded her arms, waiting. Jason met her gaze. "You were right. I shouldn't have kept that from you." She blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "It's not really about the money, Jason. It feels like you wanted to hide an important part of your life." He nodded slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the handle of his cup. "Because sometimes my life feels more like a cage than anything else." Jessica frowned, her curiosity deepening. "What do you mean?" Jason took a sip of coffee before answering. "Since I was a kid, I was trained to take over the company. I never had a choice. Every decision was made for me. Even the people I spent time with were chosen by my family." Jessica studied him carefully. She had always seen Jason as someone in control, confident, self-assured. But now, she was starting to see something else. "And you never wanted that?" she asked. Jason let out a small, almost bitter chuckle. "I don't even know what I want. I just know that for the first time in a long time, coming here, talking to you, it feels like a choice I actually made for myself." Jessica felt her heart skip a beat. She hadn't expected that, and suddenly, everything between them felt a little more complicated. "I never wanted to be surrounded by people who only care about money," Jessica finished for him. Jason met her gaze, his silence confirming what she already knew. The truth was finally out, and now everything about him, his quiet confidence, his carefully chosen words, his reluctance to share too much, made perfect sense. "Is that why you ended up here?" she asked, her voice softer now. A small, almost wistful smile crossed Jason's lips. "I guess so." Jessica exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "And what did you find?" His fingers wrapped around the coffee cup as he looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Something real." Jessica felt the warmth of his words settle deep inside her, unexpected yet undeniable. She had spent days questioning who he really was, but now, in that simple moment, she understood. He wasn't just looking for anonymity, he was searching for something genuine, something that had been missing from his carefully constructed world. Before she could respond, the sound of a customer calling her name broke the moment, and she reluctantly turned away. But even as she went about the rest of her shift, the conversation lingered in her mind, refusing to be ignored. That evening, as Jessica stepped outside to head home, she wasn't surprised to find Jason leaning casually against his car, hands tucked into his pockets as he watched her approach. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms with a playful smirk. "This is becoming a habit, you know." He tilted his head, his smile easy and familiar. "I thought you'd be used to it by now." "And what if I said I wanted to walk home alone today?" Jason straightened, his expression sincere. "Then I'd respect that." Jessica studied him for a moment before sighing dramatically and opening the car door. "But I think I'll take the ride." His grin widened as he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. Unlike their previous drives, this time there was no tension, no unspoken doubts hanging between them, just an easy, unguarded silence. After a few minutes, Jason glanced at her. "Do you want to take a little detour before heading home?" Jessica arched an eyebrow. "Where to?" "It's a surprise." She hesitated, searching his face for any clues, but his expression gave nothing away. Finally, she shrugged. "All right." Jason took a turn onto a quieter road, guiding the car through winding streets until they reached a secluded park, bathed in the warm glow of old-fashioned street lamps. In the center stood a wooden gazebo, its lattice adorned with vines, and beyond it, a still lake reflected the moonlight. Wooden benches lined the path, empty except for the occasional flicker of fireflies dancing in the night air. Jessica stepped out of the car, taking in the peaceful scene. "I've never been here before. Not many people know about this place," Jason said, watching her reaction. Jessica turned toward him, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "How did you?" Jason simply smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets as he took a step forward. "Come on, let's walk." And for the first time since meeting him, Jessica felt like she was finally seeing the real Jason Stone, the man behind the name, the fortune, and the secrets. They stepped out of the car, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. The park was quiet, the kind of place where the world seemed to slow down. Jason led Jessica to a bench near the water's edge, and she sat, folding her arms against the slight breeze. The lake stretched before them, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the soft glow of the street lamps. "Do you come here often?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason exhaled, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. "Sometimes, when I need to think." Jessica turned slightly, studying him from the corner of her eye. "And what are you thinking about now?" His lips curved into the smallest of smiles as he finally looked at her. "That this has been the best thing to happen to me in a long time." Jessica's breath hitched for just a second. She hadn't expected that. She looked away, focusing on the shimmering reflections on the lake, but she could still feel his words lingering between them. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was thick with meaning, filled with all the things neither of them were ready to say out loud. When Jason dropped her off at home later that night, something between them felt different, more fragile, more real. Jessica stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, her heartbeat still unsteady. She closed her eyes, pressing her palm against the cool wood as if that could steady the whirlwind inside her. Outside, Jason remained in his car, gripping the steering wheel, staring at her house through the rearview mirror. He knew he was falling into something deep and unknown, but for the first time in his life he wasn't sure if he was ready. And worse, he wasn't sure if he had any control over it at all. In the days that followed, Jessica tried to pretend nothing had changed. That her heart didn't beat faster when Jason walked into the diner, that she didn't catch herself looking at him differently. But she couldn't lie to herself. What had started as mere curiosity had transformed into something stronger, something she wasn't ready to name. Jason, as always, was there every morning, sitting at the counter like clockwork, waiting for his coffee. But now that she knew who he truly was, she saw him differently. The little details stood out more clearly. The quiet confidence in the way he moved, the effortless charm in his voice, the way his gaze took in everything without giving too much away. And then there were the things he didn't say. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he had told her everything that mattered. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that there was still something missing, something just out of reach. And then, that afternoon, while Jessica wiped down the tables after the lunchtime rush, a murmur rose from the television mounted in the corner of the diner. The low hum of voices and clinking plates faded as she turned her head, her breath catching at the sight of the news anchor's serious expression. Businessman Jason Stone was seen last night leaving an exclusive event at the Rockwell Hotel's family estate. Sources confirm he is set to take over as the company's next president, following in his father's footsteps. Jessica froze, the cloth slipping from her fingers onto the table. The world around her kept moving, the diner still buzzing with conversation, but she couldn't hear any of it. Jason was about to become the president of the Rockwell Hotels. Her grip tightened on the back of the chair. How long had he known, and why hadn't he told her? The plate in Jessica's hand nearly slipped, her fingers tightening around the edges at the last second. Her breath caught as she turned toward the television, the world around her fading into a dull hum. There on the screen was Jason, impeccably dressed in a sharp tuxedo, standing under the bright lights of a high-profile gala. Reporters surrounded him, microphones angled in his direction, while business executives hovered nearby, exchanging pleasantries with easy familiarity. He stood among them effortlessly, as if he belonged there. Because he did, Jessica's stomach twisted. He looked nothing like the man she had come to know, the man who claimed he wanted something real, who had sat at the diner counter every morning, sipping coffee like he had nowhere else to be, the man who had told her he wanted to escape this very world. Her chest tightened. "So it was all a lie," she murmured, the words barely audible over the chatter in the diner. "Jessica?" A coworker called her name, but the voice was distant, muffled beneath the roar in her ears. She didn't respond. She simply untied her apron with quick, jerky movements, tossed it onto the counter, and walked out. She needed answers. The walk to the hotel felt longer than it should have. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by doubt, by anger, by the nagging ache in her chest. The city lights blurred around her, but all she could focus on was the question pounding in her mind. Had she ever truly known Jason at all? When she reached the grand entrance of the Rockwell Hotel, the towering glass doors gleamed under the glow of chandeliers. 2 security guards stood at the entrance, their sharp eyes scanning her as she approached. "Can I help you?" one of them asked, his voice polite but firm. Jessica squared her shoulders. "I'm here to see Jason Stone." The guard's expression barely shifted, but there was a flicker of something, skepticism maybe. "Mr. Stone is busy." Her patience was running dangerously thin. "Then tell him Jessica is here, he'll see me." The guard hesitated, studying her for a second longer before lifting his radio and murmuring something into it. A response crackled back almost immediately, and with a small nod he stepped aside. "You can go in." Jessica swallowed hard as she stepped through the doors. The lobby was breathtaking. Marble floors polished to perfection, golden chandeliers hanging like cascading stars, and an atmosphere so refined it felt like stepping into another universe. The people around her moved with quiet confidence, dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses, effortlessly belonging to this world of wealth and privilege. And then she saw him. Jason descended the grand staircase, every step measured, every movement precise. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, the kind that whispered power and status. There was no trace of the easygoing man who had leaned against his car waiting for her, no sign of the Jason who had taken her to a quiet park just to escape. His gaze locked onto hers, his expression shifting, first surprise, then something unreadable. "Jessica?" His voice was low, uncertain. "What are you doing here?" She crossed her arms, her jaw tight as she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I should be asking you that." Jason frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" She let out a bitter breath. "I saw you on TV, Jason. You were at some exclusive event last night, talking about taking over your family's company." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken for far too long. Jessica searched his face for an answer, for something, anything, that would make this feel less like a betrayal, but all she saw was the truth she had been trying to ignore. He had never really left that world. And maybe he never would. Jason ran a hand through his hair, exhaling a slow, frustrated sigh. "Jessica, you lied to me." His gaze sharpened, his posture stiffening. "I never lied." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Oh really? Then tell me, Jason. What were you doing here last night, dressed like them, standing among them, while telling me you wanted nothing to do with this world?" For a moment he said nothing. His silence was an answer in itself. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't have a choice." Jessica's chest tightened. "There's always a choice." He looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "It's not that simple." Her voice wavered, but the hurt in her chest was stronger than her hesitation. "You made me believe you wanted something different, that you wanted something real." "And I do," he said, his voice quieter now, edged with something close to desperation. She shook her head. "But that's not what it looks like." Jason stepped forward, reaching for her hands, his grip warm, steady, pleading. "Jessica, please, listen to me." She pulled away, retreating a step as if distance could protect her from the ache settling deep in her chest. "I trusted you, Jason, and now I see I was naive." Something in his expression shifted, an unspoken fear, a realization that she was slipping through his fingers. "Don't go." Jessica swallowed against the lump forming in her throat. "I don't belong in this world, Jason." His voice dropped, raw and quiet. "Do you think I do?" She blinked back, the sting in her eyes, but the emotions swirled inside her, uncontainable. "I don't know what to believe anymore." And with that, she turned. She walked away, past the gleaming floors, past the towering chandeliers, past the world that was his and never hers. Jason stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, watching her disappear through the glass doors, feeling something hollow open inside him. He had spent years following a path that had never felt like his own. But losing Jessica? This was different. This was something he didn't know how to fix. That night, Jessica sat on her porch, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the quiet darkness. The night air was cool, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still spinning, her heart still aching with everything she didn't want to feel. After a few minutes, her mother stepped outside, sitting beside her on the porch steps. A long silence stretched between them before her mother finally spoke. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jessica let out a heavy sigh. "I thought he was different." Her mother gave a small, knowing smile. "Maybe he is, but people make mistakes." Jessica frowned, resting her chin on her knees. "What if he was never honest with me?" Her mother was quiet for a moment, then gently asked, "Or what if he just didn't know how to be?" Jessica didn't have an answer, and that terrified her more than anything. Her mother gave her a kind, knowing look. "There's only one way to find out." Jessica stayed silent, gazing up at the vast night sky. Stars blinked dimly in the distance, scattered like unanswered questions. But at that moment, she wasn't sure if she even wanted the truth, because the truth could change everything. While across the city, Jason stood alone in his hotel office, the weight of the night pressing heavily on his shoulders. He leaned against the window, staring at the glittering skyline, but all he could see was the distance, growing between him and the one thing that had ever felt real. Jessica. He had spent his whole life searching for something beyond boardrooms and expectations, something genuine, and now that he had found it, he was on the verge of losing it. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. The clock was nearing midnight when Jessica finally stood up from the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as the cool night air whispered against her skin. The quiet of the neighborhood felt heavier than usual, like the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, the house was still. Her mother had already gone to bed, but their conversation lingered in Jessica's mind, like an echo she couldn't escape. She wanted to believe Jason hadn't lied, that he was just a man caught between the life he had been given and the life he wanted. But how could she trust someone who seemed to exist in two completely different worlds? Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, shadows stretching across the walls. No matter how much she tried to push it away, the ache in her chest was undeniable. She cared about him, more than she should, but caring wasn't enough. Jason didn't sleep that night. Hours passed as he sat in his office, the city lights flickering against the glass, but he didn't really see them. Jessica had been the first person to look at him and see beyond his last name, the first person to treat him like an ordinary man, the first person to make him feel like he could be something more than his family's legacy. And now, she saw him the way everyone else did. He had never cared what people thought of him before, but caring about what Jessica thought, that terrified him. He picked up his phone, fingers hovering over the screen. He typed out a message, deleted it, tried again. But what could he even say? Sorry wouldn't be enough. He wanted to explain everything, to make her understand that he had never lied about his feelings, but words felt empty without a way to prove them. For the first time in his life, Jason felt completely lost, and for the first time he realized that maybe Jessica wasn't the one running away. Maybe he was. In the days that followed, Jessica and Jason lived in separate worlds. She buried herself in work, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. Every morning she went through the motions, pretending she wasn't waiting for him to walk through the diner doors. And Jason was still trying to figure out how to fix what he had broken. Jason buried himself in work, forcing himself into the relentless rhythm of his family's business. Meetings blurred together, figures and reports became background noise, and yet, no matter how much he tried to focus, his mind drifted elsewhere. Back to her. Each morning at the diner felt incomplete without him sitting at the counter, waiting for his coffee. Jessica told herself it didn't matter, that his absence was insignificant, but it was. She missed him. She missed the quiet moments, the way his presence had become a part of her day. She missed their conversations, their playful banter, the way he looked at her as if he saw something in her that no one else ever had. But missing him wasn't enough. She couldn't just let him walk back into her life. Not without knowing for sure that he truly wanted to be there. And Jason knew that waiting for Jessica to forgive him wasn't enough. He had to show her, prove to her, and to himself, that he was willing to change. That he wasn't just another man molded by his family's expectations, trapped in a life he had never chosen. And there was only one way to do that. That night, Jason made a decision. He was going to leave the Rockwell hotels. It was the only way. The next morning, he stood outside his father's office, exhaling slowly before stepping inside. His father sat behind an expansive mahogany desk, scanning documents with sharp, calculating eyes. He barely glanced up as Jason approached. "I need to talk to you," Jason said, his voice steady. His father finally looked at him, arching a brow. "So, talk." Jason's jaw tightened. "I want out of the company." For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, his father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "This is a joke, right?" "No," Jason said firmly. "I'm serious." A low chuckle escaped his father's lips, though there was no amusement in his eyes. "You think you can just walk away?" "I know I can." His father's smile faded. He studied Jason carefully, as if measuring the weight of his words, the resolve behind them, and then his expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, son." Jason met his gaze without hesitation. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can unlock a story no one ever expected. Jessica didn't know she was paying the fare for a millionaire, and Jason didn't know that one bus ride would change how he saw the world. In a life surrounded by power and wealth, he had never felt so powerless, until someone with almost nothing gave him everything he needed, a moment of truth. But what happens when secrets resurface and truths are too heavy to carry? Just when Jessica begins to open her heart, she discovers Jason isn't just a man with secrets. He might be the heir to everything she's been running from. Can love survive when the truth threatens to tear it all apart? Or was their story always meant to be temporary? In part 2, Jessica walks away. But what if this time, Jason walks away from everything, just to follow her? Don't miss the next chapter, because the real story is just beginning. Subscribe and turn on notifications for part 2, coming soon.